The hallway backstage was narrow, lined with folding chairs and equipment cases, lit by the kind of flat fluorescent light that exists only in the parts of a venue the audience never sees. It was a festival night in the mid-2000s, one of the touring multi-comedian showcases that moved through arenas and large theaters, putting several names on one bill, one after another, for a crowd that had come for the whole night rather than any single performer. Somewhere beyond the wall, the murmur of a few thousand people settling into their seats came through as a low, steady hum. Kevin Hart stood near a stack of road cases, going over his set in his head the way comedians do in the minutes before they go on. Not rehearsing lines so much as running through the shape of the next 20 minutes, the order of bits, the places where he knew the crowd usually leaned in, and the places where he sometimes lost them. He had a slot on the bill that night, not the headliner, not the opener, somewhere in the middle, the position reserved for comedians who had built enough of a name to matter, but who were still, in every sense that counted, on their way up. Katt Williams was also on that bill. By that point in his career, he wasn't someone audiences needed introduced to. His name carried weight on a poster, and his presence on the lineup meant something to the people putting the show together and to the comedians sharing the bill with him. He had a few minutes before his own set, and he was walking the same hallway Kevin Hart was standing in. What happened in the next few minutes wasn't planned by anyone. There was no producer arranging an introduction, no moment built into the show for two comedians to interact backstage. It was simply two people at different points in their careers occupying the same narrow space for a short stretch of time before a show pulled them both back into their own separate nights. To understand why this brief exchange mattered the way it did, it helps to understand what comedy festivals were like during this era, and what Backstage actually felt like on a night like this one. Multi-comedian festival shows in the 2000s were built differently than club gigs or solo specials. They were large productions, arenas or big theaters, sometimes 5 or 6 comedians on a single bill, each getting a set length determined by where they fell in the lineup. For audiences, these nights were events, often advertised with all the names listed together on one poster, each performer bringing their own following into the same room. People bought tickets for the whole night, not just for one name, which meant the energy in the building shifted constantly. A crowd that came in loud for one comedian might cool slightly for the next, then build again for whoever came after. Reading that shifting energy night after night was its own skill, one that had nothing to do with the material itself and everything to do with timing, instinct, and the ability to adjust on the spot. For comedians, though, festival nights were something else entirely. A high-pressure environment where everyone on the bill was, in some sense, performing in front of each other as much as in front of the crowd. Reputations on the circuit were built and reinforced on nights like these. A strong set on a festival bill could be talked about for weeks among other comedians, not because anyone wrote about it, but because word traveled through the same network of people who worked these shows, city after city, year after year. A weak set could be talked about too, quietly, in the same way. Backstage at these shows was a small, crowded world. Dressing rooms were shared or non-existent. Hallways became green rooms. Comedians waited near the stage entrance, sometimes for hours, listening to the comedian before them through the walls, gauging the crowd's energy before they themselves walked out into it. Equipment cases doubled as seating. Someone was always running past with a headset and a clipboard, checking set times, making sure the next name was ready to go. Amid all of that motion, there was also a particular kind of stillness. The focused, slightly nervous stillness of people about to do something difficult in front of thousands of strangers, often back to back, with very little time to reset between sets. In that environment, comedians develop a kind of backstage etiquette. Conversation happens, but it's usually brief. A comment about the crowd, a question about how the previous set went, sometimes nothing at all beyond a nod. Everyone understands that the person standing next to them is about to walk into the same uncertainty they're about to walk into, or has just come back from it. There's a shared understanding that doesn't need to be spoken. This is a hard thing to do, and everyone in this hallway is about to do it, or has just finished doing it. Years on the circuit teach comedians to recognize that look on someone's face, the inward focus, the slight stillness, and to respect it, usually by leaving it alone. For Katt Williams, this period of his career was one defined by momentum. He had spent years building a reputation through stand-up that audiences and other comedians alike had come to recognize as something distinct. Sharp, observational, built on a voice that didn't sound like anyone else's. By the time he was appearing on festival bills like this one, he wasn't someone trying to prove himself anymore. He had already proven what he could do on a stage. What he carried with him backstage wasn't nervous energy in the way a newer comedian might feel it. It was something closer to focus, the quiet concentration of someone who knew exactly what he was about to walk into and exactly what he intended to do with it. That focus had a particular quality to it. People who worked with him during this stretch of his career often described it less as tunnel vision and more as a kind of heightened awareness. Someone who, even while preparing for his own set, never quite stopped noticing the room around him. It was the same instinct that fed his material on stage, an ability to look at something ordinary and see the detail in it that everyone else had walked past. Backstage, that instinct didn't switch off. It simply pointed at different things. The crew member who looked exhausted, the comedian pacing near the stage door, the small signals that told him something about the night before he'd even stepped into the light. That kind of attention didn't mean he was constantly engaging with everyone around him. Most of the time, it stayed exactly where it usually stayed. Internal, observational, feeding whatever was coming next on stage. But every so often, it surfaced as something else, a comment, a glance, a few words directed at someone who probably wasn't expecting them. Kevin Hart, at this point, was in a very different place. He had been working steadily for years, building a name through clubs, smaller festival slots, and television appearances that were starting to add up. He wasn't unknown. People on the circuit recognized him, and his name on a bill meant something to a growing audience. But he was still, by his own description in later years, hungry in the way that comedians are hungry when they can see the next level but haven't fully arrived at it yet. Festival nights like this one were part of how that climb happened. Chances to perform in front of bigger crowds than club work usually offered, in rooms that could make or break how a comedian felt about their own material. Standing backstage that night, going over his set, Kevin Hart was doing what most comedians in his position did in those minutes, focusing inward, trying to manage the particular tension of a big crowd set, the kind of tension that doesn't go away with experience so much as become more familiar. He wasn't pacing or visibly anxious. He was simply somewhere else mentally, running through the architecture of his act, the way performers do when a set is close enough that there's no point thinking about anything else. This was the moment when Katt Williams, walking the same hallway with a few minutes before his own set, noticed him. What happened next wasn't dramatic in the way these stories sometimes get told afterward. There was no long conversation, no sitting down, no extended exchange of advice. By most accounts from people who were around that circuit during this period, it was something much smaller. Katt Williams stopped, said something directly to Kevin Hart, and then kept moving toward his own set. The pause itself lasted only a few seconds. Katt Williams didn't change direction dramatically or pull Kevin Hart aside into some quieter corner. He simply slowed as he passed, turned slightly, and spoke. The kind of small interruption that, in a hallway full of people moving with purpose, barely registers to anyone else nearby. No one stopped what they were doing. No one turned to watch. It was the kind of moment that, if a camera had been rolling, would have looked like nothing at all. Two people exchanging a few words in passing, the way people do constantly backstage at shows like this. The words themselves, according to those who have talked about this kind of moment over the years, weren't elaborate. They weren't a speech about the business or a breakdown of what Kevin Hart should or shouldn't be doing with his act. What Katt Williams said was simpler than that. Something about trusting his own voice, about not trying to be anyone else's version of funny, about the fact that the thing that made him different was the thing worth protecting, even when it would have been easier, in a room that size, to play it safer. It wasn't framed as advice in the way advice usually sounds. Not "you should" or "you need to." It was closer to an observation, delivered quickly, the way one comedian might say something to another simply because it was true and because there happened to be a moment to say it. There was no build-up to it, no sense that Katt Williams had been thinking about what to say. It came out the way an honest thought does when there's no time to dress it up. Direct, unforced, and over almost as soon as it started. And then Katt Williams was gone, moving toward the stage entrance, already shifting into the focus he needed for his own set. For Kevin Hart, the moment passed quickly. There wasn't time for it not to. His own set was coming up, and the backstage rhythm of a festival night doesn't pause for anyone, no matter what was just said in the hallway. He went on. He did his set. The night continued the way festival nights do, one comedian after another, the crowd's energy rising and falling across hours of comedy, until eventually the show ended and everyone went their separate ways into the night. By any outward measure, nothing happened. No headline, no story that made its way into the trades the next day. Just two comedians on the same bill exchanging a few words in a hallway before going on stage. The kind of thing that happens constantly on tours like this one and is almost never remembered by anyone except the people directly involved. But for Kevin Hart, it stayed. In interviews and conversations over the years that followed, as his own career grew from festival middle slots into headlining tours, television, and eventually film, Kevin Hart occasionally spoke about the comedians who shaped his thinking early on. Not always in dramatic terms, but with the kind of specificity that suggests certain moments left a mark even when they looked small from the outside. A few words from someone he respected, delivered quickly backstage, at a point when he was still figuring out exactly what kind of comedian he wanted to be. That kind of moment doesn't need to be long to matter. Sometimes it's the brevity itself that makes it land. There's no time for it to feel like a lecture. It's just true, and then it's gone. And the person who heard it carries it forward, whether they fully register it in the moment or not. What that backstage exchange revealed about Katt Williams wasn't about generosity in some abstract sense. It was about the kind of attention he paid to the people around him, even in the minutes before he had to walk into a room of thousands of strangers himself. He didn't need to say anything to Kevin Hart that night. Nothing about the show required it. But he noticed someone standing in a hallway, carrying the particular weight that comes before a big set, and he said something anyway. Not as a mentor delivering a lesson, but as one comedian acknowledging another, briefly, honestly, before getting back to his own work. What it revealed about Kevin Hart was something about how he carried moments like that forward. He didn't turn it into a story right away. He didn't make it part of his act or talk about it publicly for years. It simply became part of how he thought about his own voice, a small data point, absorbed quietly, that surfaced later as his career grew into something that required exactly the kind of self-trust Katt Williams had pointed toward in that hallway. Looking back at that night now, what stands out isn't the festival itself, or even either comedian's set. By most accounts, both were solid, well-received, forgettable in the way that good but not extraordinary sets on long festival bills often are. What stands out is the hallway, the fluorescent light, the hum of the crowd through the wall. Two comedians at different points on the same long road, crossing paths for less than a minute, with one of them saying something simple and true to the other before they each walked back into the noise. Neither of them could have known, standing there, how far either of their careers would go. All that existed in that moment was a hallway, a few words, and the particular kind of respect that exists between people who understand exactly what the other is about to do. That's the part of the story most people never heard. Not the festival, not the sets, not anything that made it onto a poster. But a few words in a backstage hallway, said quickly, meant simply, and carried forward by the person who heard them for longer than either man probably expected.